Wales Operations Manager for the National Residential Landlords Association. Timothy Douglas, Head of Policy and Campaigns for Propertymark, and Richard Rowntree, Mortgages Managing Director for Paragon Bank. Before we begin with questions, could I just give the apologies of Mabon ap Gwynfor, who unfortunately had to leave committee because he's got competing commitments today, but he did ask me to give his apologies for this particular session and the next one. Just to say that, as ever, time is limited, so please feel free to give full answers, but if somebody's already said something, obviously there's no need to repeat that. And similarly with committee members, we'll all have to be concise. Okay, let me begin then with an initial question on policy and vision of Welsh Government, and your view really as to does Welsh Government have a clear role for the private rented sector in Wales, and is there anything you think is lacking that Welsh Government should include in its vision, if it has one? Who would like to begin? Stephen. Yeah.
Of course, and thank you, Chair. I have watched all of the evidence sessions so far, and I think you've opened with that question every time. And I think the different questions the different answers that you've received have shown that I don't think there is a clear strategy. I'm sure that the politicians, the ministers themselves will have an idea of what they want the PRS to be. But as a country, as a sector, I don't think that's very clearly relayed, and potentially most importantly to those who provide the service. Due to the nature of my job, I spend a lot of my time in rooms with landlords, and other than feeling vilified and demonised for providing a service to the country and to the residents that live in their properties, they don't know what the government wants from them. They constantly question, they see new legislation coming out, they see consultations, they see all of these, but they don't know where the Welsh Government wants to take the PRS. They're willing, they're happy to go on a journey, but they don't know where that journey is taking them.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Stephen. Timothy, yeah, Timothy?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Chair, and the committee for the invitation to give evidence today. I think we would, Propertymark, agree with that, and our property agent members across Wales. There needs to be more of a vision from the Welsh Government. I don't think there's a strategic document that perhaps we can all refer to. As has been alluded in the various sessions, there's not necessarily an ongoing housing survey where we're collecting data and seeing those trends. And I think there probably is frustration and now relief post-Renting Homes Act that we should potentially see a cooling off period in terms of the intensity, the complexity of that legislation. But I do think there was frustration in the years leading up to implementation. If you think, it was passed, and then the sector had to wait 6 years for implementation. It was changed, amended, and even there has been changes to the contract. So it's obviously important that we get legislation right, but I think we need to see more of a clear vision and should learn those lessons of implementation of the most recent significant change we've seen in Wales.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard?
Good morning, Chair. Thank you for the invite. I would just add to that, along with the missing data around the property market, the more general demographic changes we're seeing in terms of an ageing population, more students that have been welcomed to Welsh excellent universities and colleges, and also the fact that people are living increasingly more alone, so under occupancy of properties as well. So all of those factors are bringing increased demand. And I think what we'd like to see is a more strategic approach across all tenures, rather than specifically looking at social, private or owner-occupied. And I think although well-intentioned, often the demand side intervention has not been backed up with supply side, which is exacerbating the issue here, but wraps in that sort of lack of data. So sort of we would love to see a Welsh housing survey, like the equivalent to the English housing survey, which would also give more confidence to lenders to help support whatever the size and shape of those tenures need to be. And just to give you some sort of context in terms of Paragon's lending in Wales, we are pioneers of buy-to-let lending going back to 1995. So we have decades of rich data. Some of that is very limited in Wales. We do lend into Wales. Over that period, we've lent 933 million, of which 407 million is still open today, up to 2,000 landlords across 10,000 loans. But that is heavily concentrated around Cardiff, Swansea, and the coastal areas. And that tends to be because of data black spots, certainly in rural Wales, where we can't get comparisons, we can't get strong rental sort of demand numbers. So we certainly want to be part of the solution in terms of how we can support here, but would welcome that sort of working together to improve the data.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. We'll move to other committee members, and firstly, Sam Rowland. Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and good morning. Thanks for being with us this morning. Very appreciated. Just picking up, Richard, your point on the supply side, there is acknowledged issues around not enough supply of housing generally, and specifically around private rental build as well. Just wondering if you think, any of you may think there may be specific government interventions that would help that supply side at the moment, and any specific interventions for greater supply on the private rental sector?
I think initially a review into all taxes impacting private landlords and the sector would be welcome. I think in an ideal world we'd want to see a reduction in the high rates for purchasing additional dwellings under land transaction tax. It's not quite as high as the 6% in Scotland, but it's obviously higher than other parts of the UK. So, you know, we looked at that and did a tax paper last year, and if you take, you know, the average property in Wales of, say, £250,000, you know, a landlord can expect to pay just under £10,000 in land transaction tax, whereas obviously, you know, there's a zero rating otherwise. That coupled with other costs we've seen in the market, change to the wear and tear allowance, the mortgage tax relief changes. So yes, these are things coming from Westminster, but I think they need to be taken and looked at in the round. So I think certainly from Propertymark agents, that supply would be looking at the tax and the costs that have been put on landlords in the last 5 years, and a review of that land transaction tax in order to reduce that 4% is the key issue we hear back from members. Thanks.
Sorry, to agree on that, many of you will have read our State of the PRS in Wales document that we released a little while ago, and in that we also called for the review on land transaction tax because we believe that we need a vibrant PRS in Wales. And what does vibrant mean? Well, a vibrant isn't one that makes millions of pounds for landlords. It's one that supplies properties to those who need them and allows the landlords to have a progressive taxation system. So outside of your control, obviously, we've got Section 24 in London, which stops the interest rates being claimable. We do have the 4% land transaction tax, and we have been making representations to have that reviewed back to the other level. And whilst we accept that that does mean a decrease in revenue income, we believe that the benefits would outweigh them because of your ongoing costs from your revenue budget as a government. But, you know, when we're talking about supply, we were asked to do a news article for Good Morning Britain when the consultation on fair rents came out. And we all know how journalists work. The request was, can we go to Cardiff, stand on the street with lots of to let signs? The journalists couldn't find one. That's the truth of where we are in Wales at the moment. You know, we're talking about rent controls. Landlords don't set rents, markets do. There is a drastic shortage of properties in Wales at the moment. We're back to that word of having a vibrant PRS. We have development control committees around all of our local authorities with planning departments that are understaffed. We have the phosphate issues. We have developers who are ready to put spades in grounds but can't because of licensing on the phosphate issue. We have to look at this overall. We have a shortage of houses, and the Welsh Government does have to act because you build houses, we'll have people stop and living in hotels, in temporary accommodation, which is exempt from fitness for human habitation. So when we're saying about people living in rooms, they could be damp in them because they're not under the Rent in Homes Wales Act. That only gets addressed when we build more houses, we have a progressive taxation system that encourages people to diversify their investments. You know, we're talking 70% of landlords have 1 or 2 properties. These aren't multi-million-pound property developers. They are people providing a service that benefits the tenants as well.
Thanks.
And I would just add, we are due a couple of significant reports reports, which I can follow up with the committee at a later point. So it's the first one being around the homes we need, which is a UK Finance report that's looking more strategically at how the 10 years interact. And I think that will help with some policy recommendations on the supply side here as well. And also PwC are this month due to launch a review around the private rental sector, and specifically around Wales, that will show the gross value add to the Welsh economy is 1.6 billion of the private rental sector, supporting 14,000 jobs. So it's a much wider piece here. And as I say, that will follow on with the evidence and data as they're published.
Thanks. And just in terms of going back to improving that supply side, and Steve, you raised a couple of specific points that are kind of preventing supply at the moment, but there's probably opportunity out there for institutional investors as well, especially in terms of build to rent. Is there anything the Welsh Government could or should be doing to attract those institutional investors more into Wales? Is there anything specific, or is it a general tone or message that perhaps Welsh Government should be considering when it comes to attracting that investment into Wales?
Broadly on the point around build to rent, I mean, we have property agents within membership who do carry out build to rent. So I think it's important that we have the property agency housing market is a broad church, and I think build to rent does have a part to play. Why can it play that part? Well, many renters encounter issues, say, in the traditional PRS, so short-term leases, or maybe complaints around rents unfairly increasing, or landlords slow to do essential repairs. So the build to rent has that benefit of often offering tenancies up to 3 years, a dedicated on-site manager, purpose-built communal spaces. However, it comes with a premium price tag. So it's not going to work everywhere, and not everyone's going to want it. And often the developments of build to rent target certain demographics, so young professionals or over 55s, pets as well is a big thing that build to rent have focused on. So I think it's important that we have a healthy housing mix for everyone, but it needs to be part of supporting, I suppose, the traditional landlord, and then looking at where build to rent can come in and facilitate those parts of the market that want it.
And in the interest of brevity, I agree with everything. Just to finalise it, that it fits into that strategy. Where does build to rent fit in within the strategy of the overall PRS in Wales? Because without that clear message on what the strategy is, then we don't know where that fits. And it's obviously a big thing at the moment, but what will it be in 5 years' time?
Yeah. Richard, from a lending point of view, that would be helpful.
We support build to rent, has a role to play, but I would echo the point around it is a premium product in terms of where we are seeing the demand, supply and balance at the moment. Those that find it the most difficult to access the private rental sector are those with the most limited budgets, those that are most vulnerable. So I think it doesn't really support that general demand piece.
Sam, just before you continue,
Sure.
Carolyn Thomas would just like to come in. Yeah. Carolyn, excuse me, Carolyn.
Yeah, just I want some clarification on a few things. So Stephen mentioned that damp homes will only improve if more homes are built. The PRS doesn't know what government wanted them. Well, surely it's a home that's adequate to live in. And private rental sector is a premium product, I just heard as well. But to me, private rental sector it's changed, hasn't it? Shifted because we haven't got enough social homes, but it is about having a home adequate to live in. So just hearing that, alarm me a little bit, that damp homes will improve if more homes are built. So just like you to, for the record, really, if you have to come back on that. Thank you.
Of course, and what I mean by that is if a local authority has the choice of 2 houses to put somebody into temporary accommodation, one of them has damp and one of them doesn't, the local authority will put that person into the house that doesn't have damp. But if there's only one house available and it has damp, then they can only put them into that house. So what I mean is, if you have more houses, you will raise the standard by having the choice available to you. And that's across. So I'm not just meaning the local authority there. If you are a tenant and you have a choice of 5 or 6 houses all at the same price, you will choose the best house for you. If you don't have it, then you will take the only one that's available. And my point around temporary accommodation having mould in it is from personal experience. I've seen it myself. It's either that or nothing, because the supply isn't there to contra the nothing.
Chair, yes, Caroline, I'll just come in on the premium price. I think I was alluding to build to rent specifically in terms of saying that, you know, it's a higher rent. There's a premium price tag on build to rent because of the additional facilities, the on-site management, the communal areas, often high spec that they're built to. So I think that's just needs to be part of the thinking around bringing that into the market and having a healthy private rent sector and housing market that caters for all. It's part of the solution, but it's not just the solution. I think that's what's, hopefully that helps to clarify.
And I would just add to that, Caroline, from a lender's perspective, the checks and balances are undertaken by a lender in the buy-to-let process are a force for good for standards across the private rental sector. So just to bring that to life with regards to our own experience, we decline overall 12.7% of all applications for lending in Wales. A third of those are due to condition. And often they will be damp or category 1 hazards. Now, not to say that they don't get lending elsewhere. This comes back to that data point. But also that there could be other reasons why that is declined. But the minimum standards are not really where we set. It's a minimum of good for lending against that. And we have seen, if you look across the private rental sector, improvements in standards. In 2006, 46.7% of the PRS was non-decent. That's reduced to 21.1 in 2022. Now, still work to go, but I think there is evidence that this is improving.
Okay, Sam?
Continuous theme around quality and I guess at least healthy standards of living for people as well. I wonder what you think might be the top priorities, the biggest things that Welsh Government could do to improve quality and remove hazards, or ensure hazards are removed within the private rental sector. There's something obvious that Welsh Government could or should be doing that not doing at the moment.
On that, and I think it's been referenced in terms of property MOT, and I think that type of approach could be positive if it's done in the most appropriate way. That there's across the Renters Reform Bill in England, they're looking at a property portal. So I think something along those terms could work really well if we can get an evidence base which allows multiple parties, including lenders, to have access to that to help inform as well as pull data in terms of that property MOT approach. And to continue that sort of analogy, you could then have some sort of driving license for landlords to make sure they're fit and proper. Because although standards are increasing because of the checks and balances from a lending perspective, 2/3 of the private rental sector is still a cash market, and there are less checks and enforcements there.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
And enforcement helps. We have Fit for Human Habitation under the Rented Homes Wales Act, but we need an adequate enforcement mechanism where those properties for non-members of the NRLA, because we're proud to represent good landlords who take the training. We know we offer training programs, we offer documentation. We encourage all of our members to provide properties that are compliant with the law. But we all in this room know that there are landlords who don't operate within the Rented Homes Wales Act and don't provide properties that are fit for human habitation. So the support for the enforcement must be there. When reports are made and rogue landlords provide properties that aren't up to adequacy, then enforcement is essential. And the support for those mechanisms has to be there as well.
Sure. Is there anything more to add to?
I think overall the elephant in the room, perhaps when we're talking about supply, quality and affordability, is avoid rent control. I think that is the clear message from Propertymark. It's the clear message from what we've seen in Scotland through the cost of living legislation, which introduced a rent cap on tenancy increases. And what's it causing problem in Scotland? Well, landlords have actually started, whereas the rent wasn't really, I think landlords are quite lazy in raising rents, and actually wasn't necessarily a thing that they concentrated on. But actually what we've seen is landlords increasing rents in between tenancies to cover costs or anticipated costs, because we know from the arrangement with the Scottish Government there, they are wedded to a national system of rent control. It failed to acknowledge the financial burden and cost that landlords have increased through mortgages, cost of maintenance, anything like that. And actually, the Scottish Government introduced that policy in the October. At their December budget, increased the additional dwelling supplement to 6%, almost giving people a reason to become a landlord and then put that money onto the rent. So investment has stalled, and the Landlord Association in Scotland estimate that there's now, from their finding with members, suggest that there's 22,000 homes could have been lost in the last 12 months in the private rented sector in Scotland. And I think, and actually, if you look at Zoopla's figures, I think rents in Scotland are now the highest. They've seen the highest increase, 13% across the UK. So it really needs to be avoided. And I think the other issue is, wage growth, the wider economy. Rent control wasn't talked about 10, 15 years ago. So we need to sort all these supply or demand things, or is it purely an ideological decision that governments are wedded to? So avoiding rent control is a must.
Okay, and Stephen, come back in.
If we're moving kind of into rent controls, we carry out quarterly surveys, and a lot of the information that we provided in our written supply may have changed, and we're obviously open to provide the more up-to-date information. But the worrying thing in relation to rent controls is that for 10 years, Wales had the lowest rising rents in the whole of the UK. 10 years consistently suppressed. 2 actions happened: the implementation of Rent in Homes Wales Act and the consultation on rent controls. Wales is now higher than any other part of the United Kingdom, because those lazy landlords who don't put up rents during a term suddenly thought, well, if you're going to control me going forward, I'm going to realign. Rent controls went up over 10% in Wales the month that the consultation on rent controls happened. We're back to this clear messaging, the strategy, what we want in the landlords to do, because that scared a lot of people into either putting their rents up above inflation or exiting the market completely. And this is about back to the demonisation of landlords. They're not people who run around with suitcases full of £50 notes. They're very small businesses who've diversified their investment. So if we're going to bring in rent controls, and we're all looking forward to the new paper in the summer, if that happens, be prepared for more landlords to leave the sector who haven't already, and even less supply and even more problems, very genuinely.
And I think if I could just add, the key thing that comes into is, the private rented sector is now, I think in all parts of the UK, the second largest tenure outside of owner-occupiers. So let's, speak of landlords and agents, private as key housing providers. I think that goes back to the crux of that vision, that strategy. It's a key housing provider, but across the tax regime, the economy regime, energy efficiency, welfare support. Are we looking at it in a holistic way, all government departments getting together and pulling together in order to nurture this sector, which is, as we know, often doing the job that the social rented sector did in lots of parts of the market, and with wage growth, the economy as it is, people can't afford to buy. So we're not looking for special treatment, and we're not looking for being demonised either, but I think we need to change the narrative. Landlords, agents, private rented sector is a key housing provider, but does that come through in our policy making? And I think that needs to come through and have a fair conversation about that.
Fine, and perhaps one last point, Chair, I may, on the point around rent controls. Do you think there's anything that should be done at all to mitigate any extreme spikes in rents at all?
Improve the supply. And it's as close an analogy I can have. If you have a specific car that you want and you can find 7 of them on the market, you dictate the purchase price. If you have a specific thing in mind for a property or a car and there's only one available, you'll pay whatever it takes. So if you increase the supply, and I mean the supply of good quality properties, the market dictates rents. Governments don't need to intervene. The market will dictate it. So if you build more, you make more available, you have those progressive taxation systems that encourage more people to provide PRS properties, you won't need to artificially control them. They will be controlled through their availability.
Yeah, okay. Anybody else want to comment?
Well, a temporary reprieve on the 4%, for a short period could balance things out in order to, a lower rating or 0 rating to encourage that. So I think, as Stephen said, it's about supply, but there are existing levers the Welsh Government have got through the tax system that can do on short-term measures as well as looking at it in the long term.
Yeah, sure.
Can I speak? Oh, sorry. I was just because you prompted something and I'm going to forget it otherwise. You have to think across the board. So I watched the previous evidence session, and there used to be a rent assessment committee that looked at high spikes. You got rid of that in the Rent in Homes Wales Act. So you had the mechanism as a government, and you got rid of it. Okay. So you need to be thinking about the ramifications of implementation of legislation.
Of course.
Just add to that, it's linked to that point in terms of that there will be a limit in terms of the relationship between wages and rental inflation, and we are starting to see in other regions coming off that peak in terms of what we've seen over the sort of COVID pandemic and this restriction. Clearly, the demand supply and balance is still the key factor. But also, if you look at the Scottish experience, tenants staying put reduced that supply even more because they were worried about rental increase during that period. And also, we're starting to see evidence of Scottish landlords buying in England, which again exacerbated the problem even further.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, Joel.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks ever so much for coming in this morning. It's actually been quite illuminating, actually, and if I'm honest, I agree with a lot of you said. I think if we just increase the housing stock, the free market will take care of the rent prices, and it's frustrating that others don't necessarily see it that way. You touched upon some of the challenges that the private rental market suffers from. And I know from when I speak with constituents myself, who are landlords, and as you say, many of them have inherited a property that they've wanted to rent out, or they've previously switched their mortgages to a buy-to-let and then bought a bigger property in that. And obviously that situation's just not favourable for them now. Indeed, it's something I've looked at as well, and I was advised basically not to, because you would just be paying so much tax, it's just not profitable anymore. And I just wanted to get an idea of any other challenges that you'd like to highlight that you haven't mentioned yet, but then also what sort of lessons could be learned elsewhere, because one of the markets I've been looking at a lot lately is what's happening in Ireland, and the private rental market there is in a disastrous state there. And I know the housing minister last year said that they estimate they've lost in the last 5 years about 40,000 landlords, which is a lot of private landlords leaving the sector there. And I just wanted to get your views there as well. Are we in danger of going down that route then as well?
So we have such a large private rented sector in Wales, in my opinion, because there's been decades of underinvestment in social housing. There are people living in the PRS who should be living in social housing, and they get all of the support that they should get through a social housing landlord. So the person that you've just described, somebody who's inherited a property, is now a social worker, a debt management company, a facilities manager. All of those roles have a designated place in the social housing structure, and some of the people with complex needs have those. So when you have a landlord who has to be all of those, when you have fuel prices going up and somebody falls into debt on their rent, then suddenly a small business landlord is a debt advisor, and they don't have that support network in place. And when you have things like Rent in Homes Wales and consultations on rent controls, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. I'll go somewhere else. I will go and invest my money somewhere else because the returns aren't there. LHA has now been unfrozen, but it was suppressed for a very long time. And we have created this perfect storm in Wales that does not encourage investment into the PRS that it needs, because it is there at the moment to support the social housing structure that isn't there.
I think the Republic of Ireland introduced rent controls, didn't they? Yeah. And they introduced them on, I think, existing tenancies, or essentially what it did was all the landlords who were already in the market and weren't raising their rents were penalised against new entrants who could raise the rents, and it actually, it's completely disastrous. So again, I think it's another thorn in the side for rent control. I think in terms of challenges and solutions, well, I think as I alluded to at the start, hopefully now post the Renting Homes Act we'll have a period of calm potentially in terms of, and I think there should be seriously to allow the complexity of what's been introduced to bed in, but uncertainty over rent control, uncertainty over energy efficiency. Yes, it's a UK government competency, but if we go back to the costs, that legislation was going to introduce a cost cap of up to £10,000 to get to EPCC before you could then register an exemption. So again, it goes back to that issue of you're a new buy-to-let landlord, you've got to pay your 10k land transaction tax. If the property's not C, which we know a lot of them aren't across Wales, you'd have had to fork out another 10k. So before we start, you need £20,000 as a landlord. And where's that money going to go? As we've alluded to, the landlord's agent is not necessarily lying around. So that's where the economic system has to be built in, the impact of those costs has to be built into housing policy. Building safety as well. Obviously, Welsh Government are looking at that, and we've had some positive discussions with them. Enforcement, I think, is an issue. We need to support local authorities and Rent Smart Wales to do that. But I think the final point is, you know, the Welsh Government have got professional bodies like ourselves that they could utilise. To be a member of Propertymark, you actually have to have a qualification. We personally don't think at Propertymark a day's training course to be a property agent under Rent Smart Wales is sufficient. So you have to have a qualification, ongoing training, continued professional development. We do audits and compliance, whole myriad of webinars and training. So I think there's utilise the role of professional bodies as well to support all of this stuff going forward. And ultimately, you know, use a professional, qualified property agent if you're not willing to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add to that, the cost for landlords have significantly increased over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, mainly driven by 14 bank base rate rises from 0.1% to 5.25, and the knock-on impact that has had across the cost of finance. Most loans are on an interest-only basis, so there's a bigger increase in terms of landlords' costs. And of course, for professional landlords, this is part of their business. They're in this for the long term, so they weather those costs and they carry that. For those that have only got 1 or 2 properties or non-portfolio or amateur landlords, that's led more to be uneconomic and potentially leaving, which is why those numbers are reducing and likely to increase at this point. And I think linked then secondly to the EPC point, there is a consideration around we need to raise the standards of energy performance of these properties, and that is happening. If you look in 2012, only 20.1% of properties were A to C rated. This year, that's risen to 44.9%, which is actually higher than owner-occupied. So landlords are investing, looking to create a better a better experience for their tenants, but also reduce that energy cost as well. And at the same time, you're seeing the risk-free rate, so the cost for somebody that is choosing to put their money into property rather than into a savings account has narrowed. So you can get sort of 5% return now on an instant access savings account without all of those added complications of renting property.
If I could just come back, Chair, on the energy efficiency, there's no doubt about it. We certainly see the housing market playing a key part. You know, the percentage of emissions that come from buildings and homes, we have to do our part, and we've done a lot of guidance and work with agents to work with their landlords in order to take advantage of any grant funding that's available and do all the quick wins at the property regardless of the new proposals. But new proposals will come back. But I think just a quick point on those new proposals, it might necessarily be the competence of this committee. However, why is it that for the 18 different archetypes of property that we've got across the country, everyone has to be a C, a one-size-fits-all C? It's not going to work. We're going to lose additional property. There is going to be a fallout unless there's a really good exemptions regime, unless there's a really good grant funding that's linked to the EPC, there's a proper roadmap to do those changes. Surely we must be looking at making every property as energy efficient as it can be, regardless, not just this one size fits all approach, which isn't going to work for large parts of the buildings that we've currently got across the country.
And just for the record of that, those are from the English Housing Survey, so those stats I've just quoted, so this just comes back to that data point that we need to see the same for Wales.
And again, Joe, on your question, sorry. There needs to be better communication between organisations like ourselves and the Welsh Government, because we represent those good landlords who you want within the sector. So when you're asking about what the challenges are for landlords, well, the challenge for a landlord was if they issued an incorrect occupation contract to their tenant, they could either be fined or they could have rent withheld. Now, that occupation contract has been written by the government in such a way that no tenant reads it. I think we can be honest, it's an 80-page document. When a landlord presents it to the tenant, they don't read it. They sign the bottom because they don't understand it. We've taken very basic tenancy agreements and made them into an extremely complex legal document. And the problem is that the model occupation contract that's available through the Welsh Government website is in contradiction to the Act itself. So we're expecting landlords to do a job that Welsh Government has had trouble doing with all of their lawyers. And that scared a lot of people out. They're not legal, they're not support workers, they're not all of these people that we're expecting landlords to be, and we are forcing them out of the market.
You mentioned there also about, and it's an issue that's highlighted with all the evidence, as you've probably seen yourself there, that lack of data. If you had, you know, a direct line to the Welsh Government now, as we all wish we had, I suppose, what should they be prioritising in terms of that data collection then, in terms of just actually getting an idea of sort of like rent prices around the country, or how many landlords are actually leaving the sector? Because, you know, and this is an issue that's been brought up with me by landlords, you know, they have to register with Rent Smart Wales, but then they don't have to deregister. So we don't actually get an accurate view of the rental market, really. And I just wanted to get your sort of views on that then.
You'll find agreement from all of us, I think, on the fact that the Welsh Government needs to hold accurate and up-to-date data on the housing market, which includes the PRS. And more importantly than having that is to not rely on inaccurate information, because we've been shouting for as long as we can be heard, landlords are leaving the market. And every time we say that, we're told that our evidence is anecdotal and that the Rent Smart Wales evidence shows that there are more landlords and there are more properties than ever. That information, as you've just said, is not accurate, because I speak to many people. You know, part of my role within the organisation is to understand why people leave a membership organisation that represents private sector landlords. Over half of the people who leave the NRLA tell us they're no longer landlords. I speak to landlords all the time who tell me that they're leaving the sector. I met a gentleman in London last week who showed me the text update from the Rent Smart Wales app to update. He said, well, why would I do that? I sold them 3 years ago. I've got another member who tried to register a property 2 weeks ago to be told by the Rent Smart Wales website the property was registered to somebody else. It's not just that we don't have no data, it's that we rely on incorrect data. And everybody knows the data is incorrect. And I think people have started to come around to the idea that the way that Rent Smart Wales register them and monitor them is not accurate, because, as you've said, they are required to say when they've changed their properties. They are required to tell them when they've left the sector, but they don't. So we can't rely on that data. That data is skewing the honest conversations that need to be had around the PRS in Wales. Because when we come into this building, or when we lobby, and when we do all of that, and we say people are leaving the market because we know they are, we can't keep being told that they're not because of inaccurate information. And that's currently the state in Wales.
Okay, Timothy?
Yeah, I think we would also welcome a Welsh housing survey. There's obviously the National Survey for Wales, the Housing Conditions Evidence Programme, but I think, as has been alluded to, that they're kind of inadequate. But you know, the English Housing Survey, the methodology behind it's questionnaires and a physical survey, so it is quite robust. But I think it's not just info we want on the private rented sector. I think, as Richard alluded to, owner-occupiers, vacant dwellings, mortgages, first-time buyers, energy efficiency, wellness, even and that type of thing, damp and mould, and obviously how the homes for fitness, human habitation elements of the renting homes that have come in and are working. So I think you know, it does need to happen. We do need a basic data set. But just quickly on the rent levels, I think we need to do more to support the rent officers Wales. They actually, you know, go out. They play an important function in collecting data in Wales on the PRS, particularly rent data, which then feeds in often to the housing element of universal credit, local housing allowance. So there, you know, that goes into advising ministers on, you know, valuation, property matters, and benefits. We've actually met with the rent officers and provide information to our agents, because they will come into our agents' offices and ask for information. So we've tried to standardise that and improve it. I think there's probably a bit more to be done around the trust issue, what's happening with that data from agents and landlords, but that is a port of call that we certainly need to resource and utilise, the rent officers Wales. Whether that, dare I say it, could be linked into the licensing conditions of Rent Smart Wales, it could be, but there needs, you know, there is a mechanism out there, and I think we need to utilise it, and there's some more thinking to be done on that.
Okay, Timothy.
Sorry, I'll just add one point. I would agree with the point that bad data is often worse than no data, but something that is robust that I can point to is UK finance data shows that only 2,000 properties were purchased in Wales last year with a buy-to-let mortgage. That's down from 4,000 the year before, so shows a lead indicator on this decline. And if you go back to a more normalised period, say 2014, that long-run average was about 3,500. So you already are starting to see that supply is likely to get worse rather than better in the short term without intervention.
Okay, we'd better move on. Joe, Carolyn, Thomas. Carolyn?
Thank you. I just wanted to come in about rent caps again before you leave. So you said rather than have rent caps, we need to have more supply, but it's going to take a while to build that supply. So what about people that can't afford the rents? So are you suggesting then that benefits need to increase to be able to cover the rents? I just want to ask you about that then. So the local housing allowance is set by the UK government. Welsh governments don't have any control over that. They're having to increase the housing support grant to try and cover, but just your views really for this, on behalf of the tenants.
My experience is that every organisation who works in the PRS in Wales was supporting the increase of local housing allowance, and the fact it was frozen for so long was disgraceful, because it has knock-on effects. Again, in a previous session, you've asked about the leasing scheme. Well, if you're asking landlords to rent a property to a local authority, to a tenant for 5 years, but you're going to cap or not give certainty over what the income could be for those 5 years, then you're not going to get people to buy into that in any way at all. So you're absolutely right. There needs to be a clearly defined long-term plan for what local housing allowance will do over a 5-year period, so that people, organisations, local authorities, small landlords can plan. Because only with planning will you get the buy-in on that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other suggestions in which social landlords and private landlords can work together in partnership to try and help tenants and make things better for them?
Yeah,
and for landlords?
I'd happy to come in on that. I think from Propertymark's point of view, and the thinking we've done around that is, local authorities, if they could better, yes, we know all local authorities are under-resourced, but if they could better understand the housing stock, as it were, in their area, across the social rented sector and private rented sector, in terms of a database, the types of property, perhaps a property that's been had adaptations to it through the disability funding grant, perhaps in the private rented sector, then I think they would be able to then look at where does the needs of people, where could they better be placed. So it may be that there's social rented for someone who's vulnerable, for example, a social rented sector. But if they know what type of properties in the private rented sector as well, and some form of database, then I think they would perhaps find better and quicker solutions for people. And I think, secondly, actually, landlord forums in Wales, we did a freedom of information request across the countries of the UK, and Wales came out on top. Out of the 22 local authorities in Wales, the 18 responded, and only 3 had said that they didn't have or haven't had a landlord forum since 2021. And obviously, we've had COVID, and that's pretty impressive. So I think there is the foundations there within the local authorities in terms of that communication and partnership, but I think they need to better know the type of property that's available, and then I think they'll be better placed to support vulnerable people, perhaps.
Okay. Can I just go on to pets? So we're hearing from animal shelters that there are many reasons why pets are handed over is because landlords are unwilling to accept pets. How do you think we can encourage more landlords to accept pets? I think there was a suggestion previously in a previous session about perhaps insurance or, have you got a view on this?
I've got lots of views on pets. It's been a policy area that has really dominated my work, Propertymark's work, and the portfolio of policy. I think Wales, you're in a fortunate position. You don't have a deposit cap. Do not do away with the deposit cap. Keep the no deposit cap. Do not introduce a deposit cap, because all of that's done in England is heighten the risk. Now, whether that's an anticipated risk or not, it's heightened the risk because there's a view that deposit isn't enough, and they won't be able to reclaim the damages. So in Wales, you are in that fortunate position. I think from our point of view, we've done a lot of guidance and work with agents in the sector to move to a position of pets considered when advertising a property. We don't want to see blanket bans, because ultimately it's about suitability. And a decent agent, decent professional agent, should be working with a landlord and a tenant to say what is the best suitable property I can find for the needs of this person, whether it's with a pet or no pet, children, etc. So it really is bad for business by just having those blanket plans. So we're trying to encourage that pets considered, and we've produced extensive guidance on that. But I think policymakers, you've got to recognise there may be a legitimate reason why a pet's not suitable. You might already have a pet in the property for HMO. There might be allergies, or just generally the property's unsuitable. Big dog, no garden, second floor flat. So I think all of that has to be brought into the thinking. The issue on the pet insurance is yes, but I think you'd have to amend the Renting Home Fees Act 2019 to allow it to be a permitted payment. The issue on pet insurance is that if the landlord takes it out, well, first of all, is there enough providers in the market? Are there enough pet insurance providers in the market? I think the question is specific to that. We don't know. How would the premiums work moving between properties, like on cars? We don't know. We don't know if there's a market for it. But fundamentally, we've got to be careful that obviously if the landlord takes out the pet insurance, it becomes a permitted payment. It needs to be reasonable and charged to the tenant. But we've got to be careful that the tenant doesn't take out pet insurance in month 1, cancel it in month 3, 4, because they might have come into financial difficulty, when it's needed in month 12. So the insurance product itself has to have that bridging loan in order to fund any missed payments. So there are solutions, but you take all of that in the round. I think moving to a pets considered, taking a reasonable additional deposit to cover those costs should be suffice here in Wales.
I think making it reasonable is the issue, because sometimes it's quite high. So quite a lot are just saying no because the perceived risk isn't really there, but that's they believe it to be. So
well, I think on average, I mean, Stephen, I think you might know. I mean, before the Tenant Fees Act, certainly in England, and when it was looked at with Wales, I think agents, landlords, additional 2 weeks perhaps for a pet. So that wasn't. That was, I think, the norm. Would you say so? Yeah,
I mean, look, landlords are not anti-pet. They're anti-risk, and pets provide a risk to the integrity of the property when the tenant leaves. So any opportunities to mitigate the risk are there, and obviously the fact that there's no deposit cap here allows the landlord to mitigate that risk. But there's not a load of landlords out there who hate cats and dogs. It's purely about the risk to the property.
There's no restricted covenants or terms and conditions. That we're pretty agnostic on this, so supportive of whatever the landlord's looking to do.
Okay, thank you. We will move on to Jane Bryan. Jane.
Diolch, David. And we heard from just a few questions around regulation, really, and we heard from local authorities that they'd like some more power to permanently exclude persistently non-compliant landlords from the market. Do you have any thoughts on this, or do you have any suggestions for other ways to improve enforcement within this area?
We're privileged in the fact that we represent good landlords, and we believe there is no place for a bad landlord in the sector. And any moves that can be made to remove bad landlords from the sector are welcome. It's been part of our message around the Renting Homes Wales Act is don't force good landlords out of the market because they provide the important service. The NRLA would support any moves through any enforcement that would remove bad landlords from the sector.
I would echo that. We have a lot of data from our in-house valuers that step foot in every single property that we lend on. So we do see good, bad and indifferent, as you can imagine. Having some sort of repository to feed that information into, whether it be a property portal or some sort of link to landlord licensing, we'd support. We have no tolerance for rogue or poor landlords.
I think we'd agree with support that. We've already alluded to local authorities need that funding for the enforcement, but ultimately, is Rent Smart Wales, the ultimate or the single licensing authority? And if they've not got the teeth to do it, then who has?
Okay, thank you. Well, in your written evidence, you've included a number of suggestions of how to improve and develop Rent Smart Wales. Can you tell us what improvements you think should be a priority?
Yeah, I think from our point of view, Rent Smart Wales is a good start. I mean, as I've alluded to when I was discussing our membership requirements, we don't think that a day's training course is enough for a property agent, and would allude to more of a qualification and that ongoing continued professional development. I think we're also not clear. What we hear back from our members is that reporting function, and perhaps the scrutiny that Rent Smart Wales is under. Does it annually come to this committee or any committee in terms of what it does? And I think probably some greater financial transparency around the money that's raised from the licensing, what it's going towards, and what it does would give more confidence to landlords and agents. I think it links back to the previous point about being that ultimate licensing authority and having teeth to take action.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to that clear message that we had. It's kind of full circle here. What do you want Rent Smart Wales to be? Because the landlords certainly see Rent Smart Wales as the stick in the carrot and stick scenario here. They don't feel listened to. And let's not forget that in the run-up to the largest legislation change in the history of this building in relation to the private rented sector, Rent Smart Wales closed their phone lines. That wasn't a great move. So what relationship the Welsh Government want between Rent Smart Wales and the providers of the service? You know, what is Rent Smart Wales? Is it a tenant representative organisation? Is it a licensing for the landlord? What is it? Because there are many landlords out there who just feel that they are the brick wall that they run up against when they're trying to provide the service. So some very clear, and the point raised about where the money raised goes. What does it do? What is it used for? What is it in the benefit of the landlord for? We have this evaluation coming up. The contractor has been appointed. It's going to be a very interesting document, and I'm sure a lot of people will take part in that evaluation process. But it is very much a case of what do you want Rent Smart Wales to be, and what do landlords expect it to be.
Okay, and just finally, the Housing Expert Panel suggested statutory scores on the DOORS rating scheme for letting agents to help tenants and landlords make decisions when choosing an agent. Do you think this type of scheme would be beneficial?
I think with any rating system, in theory, yes, but we've got to be careful with, you know, the scoring, the methodology, how it's worked. If we look at any Trustpilot, you know, you could one bad review online can scupper, you know, a whole annual good work. So I think we just need to be careful of the scrutiny behind the rating system and the methodology. But ultimately, I think we would say, well, there's already a body ourselves that's doing that rating system. You know, if you're Propertymark protected, you're already doing higher than what the Welsh law, the Rent Smart Wales requirements. We've got 5 company obligations. There's 10 individual declarations you must make through membership. We do audits. We ask for financial accounting reports. So again, I think it's also, you know, it's about utilising the good practice we've got in the sector. But in theory, yes. But we'd be pleased to look at the methodology, because you don't want to go down the road of, well, let's have a tenant rating system. Let's have, you know, and that's ultimately what we'll get back from our members. So we've got to have a sensible conversation about that.
Okay,
Jane,
okay. Joel, do you want to ask the final question? I know you wanted to ask on renters reform.
Well, yes, thank you, Chair. Thanks for coming back. Yeah, I just basically wanted to get your ideas on sort of what's happening in England with the Renters Reform Bill and sort of the impact that's having there, and any sort of ripples it's having in the Welsh market then, and what concerns or things would you like, you know, what concerns you have about it that might be implemented here, or what would you like to see that's been implemented with that here, if that makes sense?
I think the ultimate one for the Welsh Government, and I think all devolved governments to think about, is the requirement for landlords to have redress. Because I think, yes, that's a good thing, but our discussions with the UK Government is that what that looks like, who potentially is going to be the provider, will potentially could have a knock-on effect. For example, we've got members in Jersey and Northern Ireland. It's not mandatory to have redress in those countries as an agent. but they are part of the Property Ombudsman. If the Propertymark Ombudsman merges, perhaps, or the landscape of redress changes, it would have a knock-on effect. And obviously the redress schemes provide redress for sales agents as a mandatory requirement as well. So I'd just keep an eye on perhaps who's the provider, because that could change the redress requirements in Wales for property agents, which is a mandatory requirement. So I think that's something we are trying to work through, and hopefully the UK government are going to utilise the two existing schemes because they know the sector. 50% of landlords in England use an agent, so obviously 50% of landlords are already connected to an agent with redress, but that's to be looked at. And apart from that, I think we've got big concerns around the removal of the fixed term tenancies, which you didn't do in Wales, moving to this open-ended. Again, I think swings the pendulum too far, perhaps, towards protecting the tenant. And we know agents have tenants with children or work placements. Nurses want to have a fixed-term period to rent, but ultimately in the new world, after the first 6 months, you know, a landlord could use a ground, and actually on the second day of the tenancy, the tenant in England would be able to give the landlord, I think, 2 months' notice and then leave. So I think that the pendulum has switched, and ultimately it doesn't cover regulation of letting agents. We're pushing hard for that, but at least, as I said, in Wales you've got that, footing that. We'd like it to go further, and we'd like all property agents across the UK to be qualified, licensed, working to a statutory code of practice.
The major thing in how the renters reform will affect Wales, the beauty of devolution is that I have to say to members, well, renters reform won't affect you, but it will, because not everything's devolved. The major thing is obviously the inability to discriminate when advertising a property. But then we're back coming full circle again to supply. If you are a landlord and you have 10 tenants put in front of you as possible contract holders, you'll choose the best one for you. So you may well use an element of discrimination in who you choose. Now, whilst the renters reform will say that on the advertising you can't say no this, no this, no this, when you have a number of people who are applying for the property, you will automatically choose the best person for you. So you will automatically discriminate. So we're back to supply again. If renters reform and that element of what isn't devolved is going to be effective, tenants have to be able to choose the property they live, not. And you know, I'm here representing landlords. You know, that's what I'm paid to do. But the reality of saying to landlords you can't discriminate in adverts will mean that they will still choose the best tenant when they have the people coming forward for the property. So we're back to supply. We have to increase supply.
But that's also about the welfare system as well. You know, we don't condemn discrimination. It shouldn't be happening. And where it is, it's completely wrong. However, I think where it has happened, it has been perhaps a symptom of the way universal credit works, in arrears, agents understanding that proposed difficulties, LHA not meeting market rent. So I know the Welsh Government has lobbied the UK Government on that. It's only 12 months. We all need to do more in order to make that welfare, because it comes down to affordability. You can put no discrimination, but it's not going to change the credit check. It's not going to change the credit check. So we're going to do the credit check, and the affordability, the economy of that individual is going to come back, and that's the crux of it. So we've got to get the economy working, we've got to get wages working, we've got to get welfare working in order for it not to be an issue to start with.
And Paragon support all of the sensible recommendations with the Renters Reform Bill. I think if you're looking to strengthen the no-fault evictions here in Wales, I think the only consideration, like we do have in England, is around court capacity and our concerns around that. That'd be the only point I'd raise.
Okay.
And the only notice portion on if you're going to look to get rid of no-fault evictions is, again, the consequences of that is that if a landlord has to reserve the right to be able to issue an eviction notice, whether it's no-fault or not, if you're going to take that away, again, you're going to stop people investing in it, or you're going to find people who are using the abilities that they have. So 50% of the eviction notices in Scotland at the moment are for vacant possession. So there will always be a way to get possession notice on a property. If you're going to say to landlords in Wales, we're taking away your no-fault evictions, you have to think about what the long-term ramifications for that are as well.
Okay, thank you all three of you, for coming in to give evidence to committee today. You will be sent a transcript to check for factual accuracy. Diolch yn fawr.